morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this Clean Energy Solutions Center webinar on net zero energy solutions. I'm Christine Linz, Executive Director of GWNET, the Global Women's Network for the Energy Transition, and I'll be your moderator for this side event today. As you know, the 12th Clean Energy Ministerial is taking place virtually in accordance with the global health situation. However, undeterred, the SEM members are using online resources to work together towards the shared mission, accelerating the clean energy transitions all around the world. And to that end, the Clean Energy Solutions Center and the 21st Century Power Partnership partnered to organize this panel on net zero emission energy systems. The Solution Center helps governments design and adopt policies and programs that support the deployment of clean energy, offer services that include expert assistance, peer fora, and training. The 21st Century Power Partnership provides a mechanism for public-private collaboration to advance the deployment and the development of integrated power sector policies and programs. The partnership's focus spans energy supply, delivery, and end use, and aims to synthesize knowledge and technical analysis from the domains of energy systems integration, smart grids, and energy efficiency. These two SEM initiatives recognize the interdependent roles that policy and market structures play in the integrated energy sector. They brought together 4 experts to shed light on some of these complex topics today, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to these experts. First of all, we will hear from Dr. Kutscher, who will kick off the session with a technical overview to provide a framework for the discussion. Chuck is a fellow of the Renewable and Sustainable Energy Institute at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And he served as director of the Buildings and Thermal Sciences Center at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory until his retirement in 2018. So for the past 20 years, he has focused on climate change solutions, and Chuck will be joined by 3 panelists with diverse backgrounds in terms both of expertise and geography. First, I welcome Rana Gonheim, who is the Chief of the Energy Systems and Infrastructure Division at UNIDO, where she oversees the organization's strategy and programs in promoting a low carbon infrastructure, powering industrialization and decarbonization of industry. Rana has more than 20 years of experience in designing and implementing energy policies and programs in Africa and the MENA region. And she also leads on behalf of UNIDO global initiatives such as the Industrial Energy Accelerator and convening platforms such as the Clean Energy Ministerial and the High Level Dialogue on Energy. Second will be Dr. Priya Sreedharan. She's Program Director at GridLab, a nonprofit technical assistance organization that is working to accelerate electricity sector decarbonization in the US. Priya works at the intersection of technology and policy and has worked both in the US and in India. Previously, she was with the US Agency for International Development, India, where she helped launch clean energy initiatives. And she has also worked with the consultancy E3, the US Environmental Protection Agency, and Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. And last but not least, we will have Rodrigo Garcia Palma on the panel. Rodrigo is the CEO of Implementa Sur, a Chilean firm that consults on sustainable development and climate policy. And Rodrigo has more than 19 years of experience engaging in regulatory and market drivers for a low carbon and climate resilient transition. Rodrigo works with development banks, government agencies, UN agencies, global corporations to provide innovative business solutions and models and financial mechanisms to mobilize new sources of funding for green investments. Rodrigo has previously served as a program officer for the Chilean government, where he allocated financial incentives to a portfolio of over 150 renewable energy projects. So you see that we have a very renowned panel here, but before we engage in a discussion, I'll hand the floor to Chuck to get us set on the topic. Over to you, Chuck.
Well, thank you very much, Christine. So I'm going to cover an overview of the technologies for basically getting our system off of fossil fuels to decarbonize our energy system. So there are many causes of greenhouse gas emissions that are responsible for climate change. But energy and burning fossil fuels to produce energy, with all the CO2 that is put in the atmosphere, that is the biggest driver. And that's what I'm going to focus on in this particular session. Not to say that changes in land use and other things are not also important. But again, the number one thing we have to do is get off fossil fuels. And what you can see here is that on a global basis, we haven't been doing a particularly good job of that. You can see here that renewables are certainly growing exponentially at a very high rate, but that's a large percentage change in a small amount of energy. The world is still dominated by fossil fuels. You can see the coal has more or less leveled off, but we're still seeing growth in oil and natural gas. Okay. So here are the basic steps that are needed. And I think we're seeing more and more agreement about basically what we have to do. One thing we have to do certainly is maximize energy efficiency. We need to use energy much more efficiently and effectively. But then we need to electrify everything that we possibly can. In those cases where we absolutely cannot electrify directly, we can use electricity to produce either carbon-free or carbon-neutral fuels. Why do we need to electrify everything? Because as it turns out, what we've seen is that now the cheapest forms of energy are electricity from solar and wind. They've dropped dramatically in cost in recent years. Solar photovoltaics has dropped about 90% in the last 10 years. Wind has dropped about 70%. Battery storage has come down even more rapidly in the last 5 years. And then to enable those, more transmission, demand response, especially in the building sector. And then finally, at some point, we're going to look at removing atmospheric CO2, actually extracting CO2 out of the atmosphere. But the real critical thing to remember there is that whatever we do to get CO2 out of the atmosphere, it should not interfere with driving fossil fuel emissions to zero. It's much better to prevent a molecule of CO2 from going into the atmosphere than it is to try to extract it later. All right, so I'm going to look at the electricity sector here. And as I mentioned, wind and solar photovoltaics are the main sources of low-cost electricity now. With wind farms, we're talking both on land and out to sea. Europe has really been leading with offshore wind, but now we're even seeing it start to take off in the United States. Solar photovoltaics, many applications for that, utility scale, on rooftops, and in between that, we can have community solar or solar gardens. So here are the cost drops that I was talking about, and you can see the yellow is the drop in PV costs, very, very dramatic, but also offshore wind, onshore wind have also dropped significantly in cost, and you can see there what a decrease we've seen in the cost of lithium-ion batteries. The other thing I want to point out is, some people talk about, well, what about land use issues with all this wind and solar that we need to put out? Well, again, wind, we're seeing more growth of offshore wind. And of course, with wind turbines, you can actually continue to farm around wind turbines, and farmers see a big benefit in allowing wind turbines on their land. It's an extra source of income. But also, we're seeing new emerging ways to get PV out there. One is agrivoltaics, the idea of combining solar photovoltaics with crops and even with livestock. They're quite compatible. So again, we might see, I think we'll see more farmers embracing this just as they have with wind power. And then the concept of photovoltaics, where we have photovoltaic module arrays floating, for example, on reservoirs, where they can reduce evaporative loss from the reservoir. It eliminates the need to buy land. And also, photovoltaics run more efficiently the cooler they are. So being over a body of water maintains the efficiency. So a real challenge is that now we're talking about variable sources of electricity. How do we deal with that? One way to deal with it is to allow electricity to move around. And here, an example of a study in the United States, where basically the Western grid and the Eastern grid don't communicate with each other. If we increase those communications, if we allow electricity to move around, we can much better enable the use of these variable sources. So in the building sector, if you look at where energy gets used in buildings, space heating and hot water, the yellow and blue areas there, are huge uses of energy. And those are very, very amenable to electricity. Both of those, the space heating and hot water, are amenable to heat pumps. Heat pumps can be on the order of 3 times as efficient as direct electric resistance heating. So we've seen a movement around the world for so-called net zero energy buildings. These are buildings where they're very, very efficient to start with. And efficiency, again, is important because we're going to have to increase the size of the electric grid as we electrify these energy needs. So the more efficient we are, the less we have to grow the size of the electric grid. So you start off with a very, very energy efficient building. This is the main office building for the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. It's a net zero building, so it uses about half as much energy as a typical code compliant building in Colorado. But here we have about 2.5 megawatts of photovoltaics at various locations on the campus that serve this building. And so on an annual basis, the amount of renewable energy that it uses is equal to any fossil fuel that is used. All right, so again, electrification is key. In buildings, we have heat pumps. They have become very, very efficient in recent years. In particular, what are called mini split heat pumps have very, very high efficiencies, and they work in very, very cold climates. So you can be far below freezing with the outdoor air temperature, and still these heat pumps will be a lot more efficient than electric resistance heating. And there are various ways you can use that electricity. I mentioned heat pump water heater that's shown on the right. There are even heat pump clothes dryers that are not vented. You can see that in the lower left. And then you can certainly have electric resistant stoves, but we're seeing a real movement toward inductive stoves. You need compatible pots to use with inductive stoves, but it's a very efficient way to transfer heat and very efficient way to use electricity. And also, I know some people feel they can cook better with natural gas flame, but major chefs have basically come out and said they can cook just as well with an induction stove. So the transportation sector, if you look at where the greenhouse gases occur, the great majority of them, you can see, we're talking about 3/4 of it, is from light duty, medium, and heavy duty vehicles. And we have a solution for that. This is an example of an electric vehicle with over a 200-mile range. It's a Chevy Bolt. There's a rooftop array behind it. So these vehicles can be charged at home at very, very low rates. They have very, very low maintenance costs. So there are many, many advantages to electric vehicles, and they're becoming more and more cost effective as the cost of batteries continues to drop. Many analysts are predicting that just within the next few years, even on a first cost basis, EVs will be cheaper than gasoline vehicles. And you can see here the growth of charging. So although most charging happens at home, people want to still have the freedom to drive on trips, drive long distances. And for that, you need charging stations. And we're seeing the charging infrastructure grow rapidly around the world. In the US and other places, Tesla has a very impressive charging network. You can see here that China leads the world in terms of charging stations. Europe comes behind them. But we're seeing North America also take off in this regard. It's possible to electrify ships. Batteries weigh quite a bit. And so where we've seen electric ships with batteries, we're seeing them mostly in harbor operations, short distance ferries, that sort of thing. But when you're talking about long distance aviation or ocean going cargo ships, you're talking about using sustainable fuels. And that's the idea of taking green hydrogen, which is produced by electrolysis from water using wind or solar electricity, and converting that hydrogen into a sustainable fuel, either using the hydrogen directly or combining it with carbon to basically produce synthetic hydrocarbon fuels that are basically carbon neutral in that case. So here's the idea, just passing electricity through water, electrolysis splits the hydrogen and oxygen, and you get what's called green hydrogen. Still expensive, but coming down in cost. What are the best uses for green hydrogen? This is one view of where hydrogen makes the most sense. Ammonia in fertilizer, although ammonia can also be used for storage and for a fuel. Methanol, producing methanol from green hydrogen, and in existing fineries using hydrogen. And then the next level down, an electro or e-fuel for aviation, again, where hydrogen gets combined with carbon, a shipping fuel, steel production, that sort of thing. So those are the major uses. Now, Airbus is actually pursuing the idea of using hydrogen directly by using cryogenic storage. So it'll be interesting to see how that proceeds. But I think a lot of people are viewing future aviation as some combination of biofuels and e-fuels based on green hydrogen. So the industrial sector, there's lots of different industries that use energy. We can see here that if you look at particular products, steel and concrete are big ones. I'll mention those briefly in this presentation. But the other thing I want to point out is when you look at industrial energy use, and this is industrial use in Europe, you see here that about 2/3 of the energy need is for process heating. Quite a bit is for space heating. And so again, we know how to deal with that with heat pumps. Process heating generally will lend itself to electric resistance heating or other types of ways to use electricity. There's a variety of ways there. But for lower temperatures, you can use heat pumps. So here's a graphic showing you temperature ranges and processes where you can use industrial heat pumps. So heat pumps are limited in what maximum temperature they can achieve. But on the other hand, it's really the temperature rise that matters. And so if you have waste heat from an industrial process at a reasonable temperature, you can boost that up to higher temperatures elsewhere in the process. So there's a lot of interest in using industrial heat pumps and extending them so they can operate at even higher temperatures. Concrete manufacturing, this graphic shows you that cement is the major thing. And about 2/3 or more of the energy is actually producing the cement, the actual process emissions from breaking down limestone. So there are various things that are being done to use cementitious, supplementary cementitious materials. So a variety of different materials are being used to basically reduce the amount of limestone that has to be broken down for cement. But also it's a good application for various electric ways to provide the heat source. And then in steel manufacturing, we already produce a lot of steel using electricity if we're recycling steel. The issue comes when you're starting with iron ore. And in that case, the iron is combined with oxygen. And so you have these iron oxides, and you got to break the iron ore itself out of the iron oxide compound. Today, that's done with coal or coke, and the oxygen gets pulled out and combined with the carbon, and which gets emitted as CO2. But there are other ways to do it. There's a way, an electrolytic way to do it. And also what we're seeing is in Sweden, a new plant that uses green hydrogen in place of the carbon. And the green hydrogen basically combines with the oxygen and reduces the iron ore to pure iron, which can then go into an electric arc furnace to produce the steel. And this is a picture of what this new fossil-free steel plant looks like, where hydrogen is now the reducing agent in place of coke. All right, so a lot of these things, this is a very quick overview of these different technologies. Several of us, my co-author, Jeff Logan here is also on this panel. We produced a report in December called Accelerating the US Clean Energy Transformation. So many of you may be interested in reading that. although it focuses on the US, all these technologies that I'm talking about really have applications around the world. And if this final slide shows you the actual website, so you can take a screenshot of that and go to that website if you would like to download that report. And with that, I will turn it back to Christine for our panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Chuck, for this very concise but also very comprehensive presentation, highlighting all the different solutions that are out there to get us to net zero emission energy systems. I would like now immediately to turn to the panel and ask you about your opinion about what you think are the most difficult to abate sectors and what types of policies will be needed to support those. So whoever would like to get started, please, there is a wealth of technologies Chuck has presented. What are you thinking is the most difficult or maybe also the most promising, and what policies are needed to support this transition towards net zero?
I can get started, Christine,
okay.
if you like.
Yes,
so
ahead,
thanks
Anna.
for the introduction, and great. I mean, Chuck, you made the mission impossible possible. Within 15 minutes, really walked us through all of the technologies and options that we have. I guess I would like to speak a bit to the last piece that Chuck brought in, which is the industry and the harder to abate industry, meaning iron and steel, cement, chemicals, and the likes. And I think there are a couple of challenges there that we see. So first is that actually for us to meet our net zero goals for 2050, some of these sectors do not necessarily still have the technologies needed actually to achieve that net zero goal. So we need to really work together, governments and private sector and international community, to stimulate innovations in technologies that support the electrification of the heat processes, the intensive heat processes in this sector. On the other side, of course, there is a major challenge in some of these sectors because what is happening is that the technologies that are available at the moment to help them in decarbonizing are actually quite expensive. And the companies that are investing in these technologies at the end of the day, I mean, that's really increasing also the price of their production. And in sectors like cement and iron and steel, these are global commodities that are traded at the global level. And so, you know, that increase in pricing is really affecting the companies in making their case and making their markets. So here we come to the question that you asked, actually, Christine. So what can governments, but also what can private sector do? So one of the things that we are advocating with, also with the support of the Clean Energy Ministerial and many members, is the fact that we need to help industries, those first comers, to create markets for these low carbon products. And for that to happen, we need to make sure that there are a number of things in place. The very first thing is actually making sure that we have transparent reporting structures for the carbon content of these products. We need to make sure that there are comparable, I mean, at least if not identical, comparable standards that allow also different countries, different companies to actually compare the carbon content as well of these products. And then finally, we need to really work on triggering that, demand for the market. And that's where we see quite a big role for green procurement, be it public sector procurement, where the public sector holds quite a lot of funding that they invest in construction, and so they can really help in shaping up the market, or the private sector, where we see, I mean, already quite a number, for example, of the car manufacturers globally are making commitments for net zero. And so if they are also committing towards sourcing from low carbon sources, then that would also really help the market in getting towards that trajectory. So perhaps with that, I'd also hand over back to you, Christine, and I hope that we can create a really enriching discussion.
Thank you very much, Rana, for focusing on the industrial bit. Definitely very important in highlighting the different aspects about how to incentivize but also on how to trigger demand and help the first comers to really get their market shares. Who would like to go next? Rodrigo has raised his flag or arm. Yes, please go ahead.
So I would like to complement what Rana has very wisely added in relation to the strategies and policies for these hard to abate sectors, and considering that these are commodity sectors that they have to struggle to maintain their operational margins. Therefore, they need the type of support that can actually compensate the premium of price to invest in these mitigation technologies. And to address that, one of the areas I think it's really relevant to explore are the link between climate policies and trade policies. Trade at the global level, such as the ones that are being sketched by the European Union's Green Deal on carbon border adjustments, and the way that different regions in the world can now start to accommodate and adopt part of those carbon border adjustments in order to maintain competitiveness on a global level and avoid leakages, greenhouse gas emission leakages. As Implementa Sur, the company I lead, we have done an assessment on the potential leakages for the steel sector, and we have also provided a program funded by GEF and Fundación Bariloche in Chile, the sketch of a low carbon emission reduction trajectory for the steel sector as a whole, not only the integrated process, but also semi-integrated production, which has allowed to estimate what are going to be the more strategic investments in greenhouse gas mitigation technologies that will be required. And so this vision, this comprehensive vision of the technologies required, the sectoral targets that are needed to be set, and the trade perspective on for the regulator to jump in and to adopt the lessons learned from abroad, from the EU, is critical for the emerging markets. Yeah, that's what I wanted to add.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo, for enlarging the spectrum and building on nicely on Rana's comments. Priya, would you like to go next? You've unmuted yourself.
Sure. I agree with everything that Rana and Rodrigo have put forward in their comments. I guess to complement those answers, there are two thoughts that come to my mind, and also building on the presentation, the excellent presentation that Chuck gave. I do think it's important that we don't forget that we still need to decarbonize the electricity sector, and we have a lot of work to do to get there, even if that challenge might seem more achievable from a technological perspective, even if we are a little further on the path in this regard than we are in some of the harder to abate sectors. And the reason that's so critical is because electricity decarbonization is really, as Chuck laid out, as a foundation for some of the other sectors to decarbonize. And I know this session is not really about the electricity sector, so I'll just leave it at that. Let's not forget about what we need to do before we get to net zero. There's a lot of work that is ahead of us. I guess the other dimension that I think is really important, regardless of what sector we're talking about, is really to not lose that emphasis and actually to bring in a real emphasis around the demand sector and demand and the way we think about demand-based policies. I would say, at least of my experiences in the US and in India, the intention has been there, but as far as the implementation, it has come short, at least to what we really need. And we see these synergies between different sectors and opportunities, as Chuck laid out. Getting as much energy efficiency as possible is really the first, step, whether that's on the building side, and whether it's even whether we're talking about materials and having, using lower levels of steel and cement is another approach, aside from material substitution, and that can go a long way. And we see some of these initiatives like the U.S. Green Building Council, which is actually global now and has developed some very very impressive voluntary kinds of models and programs for green buildings around the entire world. There are more green, at one time there were more green buildings, I think, in India than in the US, and that's really, really impressive and incredible. So they're different, and I think that sort of cross-cutting sort of view of what we need to do on the demand side also holds, whether we're talking about bringing in, electric transportation in a way that is advantageous towards decarbonizing the electricity sector. I think that's something we need to look at. And I think the third point I would make that I think we all talk about this, but thinking about how we don't lose sight, the policies that enable us to not lose sight of the equity impacts when we're going through these transitions. Sure, technology is always the first thing we think about. Do we have technologies? Do we have the policies? But then really understanding what are the localized impacts? What happens when this particular, industry or mill or whatnot closes down? That has community-based impacts. And when that sort of community-based impact happens, that it has cascading consequences for our ability to, as a society, to decarbonize, not just for the impacts on those particular individuals or communities, their political ramifications and other challenges that will come from that. So not having that be sort of this footnote or last thought, but bringing that to the forefront when we are designing the policies so that we keep that big picture in mind, of course, thinking about the global sorts of interactions, but then also at a national, but at a regional and state level, thinking about implementation down to that detail level.
Yes, thank you very much, Priya. The devil is often in the detail. Chuck, you already want to come in. I wanted, of course, also to hear from you what you think are the most difficult technological areas to get to net zero, because you have so nicely laid out all of them. So I would also like to ask the $100,000 question to you. What do you think is the easiest or also the most difficult? But you come in. I guess the comments from the other panelists have raised some feedback you want to give.
Yeah, well, I will answer that question, Christine. But I first wanted to second what Priya said, and that is that just the electrification, or excuse me, not the electrification, but actually converting our grid to be carbon free is a really big challenge. So for example, in the United States, the Biden administration has a goal to have a carbon-free grid by 2035. So in 2020 in the United States, we set a record for new solar and wind generation. Over 30,000 megawatts of new solar and wind were installed. To meet the goal of a carbon-free grid in the next 15 years, we have to, if you look at that amount record amount we installed in 2020, every year for the next 15 years, we have to install somewhere between 2 and 4 times that amount of renewable electricity. That's a big job. And one thing, the reason there's such a range, it depends on how rapidly we electrify the other sectors. And so it makes sense then to electrify those sectors where we get the biggest bang for the buck. So for example, an electric vehicle is much, much more efficient than a gasoline vehicle. So electrifying cars should be one of the first things we electrify. Industry can take longer. Industry has huge capital investments. And so it's going to be costly for industry to make these changes. And we can allow those changes to take longer because as they make the changes, the grid will become more and more carbon free. And those changes will be more beneficial further on down the road. So I think staging how we electrify these other sectors is one way to make the amount of wind and solar we need to deploy a little bit more realistic to achieve.
And what about the heating sector? Are you thinking that it will be possible to electrify the entire heating sector? Because when you look at, I mean, I worked myself over the last 25 years in the sustainable energy field, and the majority of discussions, they always focus on electricity. And when you look at where final energy consumption really goes, it's mainly the heating and cooling sector in the world. And I'm just wondering whether we will really be able to fully electrify that sector. At least all the scenarios I have seen, they talk about electrifying some of it, but it will not be be completely possible. And I think it's quite a tough sector to tackle because of the decentralized nature of installations and also the small scale nature of it.
So, you know, there are people that want to continue to use natural gas, perhaps mix green hydrogen with natural gas. I think the point is, though, that heat pumps have become so efficient that I really do believe that we can essentially electrify the entire building sector. And if we look at using, for example, green hydrogen, there's an efficiency loss in electrolyzing, producing green hydrogen. It's not easy to transport. It's not easy to store, okay? You have to use cryogenic storage or very high pressure storage. And then there's another efficiency hit when you have to use it at the other end. So for all those reasons, and the other thing too is that you can't just put pure hydrogen into our natural gas lines. So you'd have to replace those lines. And so I do think that even though there are some people, some industries are pushing not to fully electrify the building sector, I personally would come down on the side of saying that I think the building sector is one that we should strive to fully electrify. Green hydrogen has other more difficult things that are hard to electrify. That's where the green hydrogen should be used.
Rodrigo, yes, please. You want to directly comment on?
Sure.
On
yeah, I wanted to recap on the issue of the integration and the large adoption of renewable energy investments. And I think more than the challenge of the actual building and operation of these additional megawatts or gigawatts of requirement that we have, I think the most challenging thing is actually to create the market space for this renewable electricity. And definitely one area to go is how we identify those thermoelectric capacity that needs to be early phased out from the power grids. We need early phase out, early decommissioning of thermoelectric plants, and that not only triggered by the competitiveness that they may be losing, but also triggered by the interest from the investors and the shareholders in the companies that should take serious commitments in the early phase out. Therefore, to create a market space for a very mature renewable electricity industry that is willing and ready to execute and implement those projects. But we need to definitely create the market space to make that happen. And there is a lot of rigidity in certain markets to avoid that to happen. At least in Chile, that rigidity has been overcome. Now there is a very serious and ambitious plan for the early phase out of coal facilities that aims by 2040 not to have any coal plant in operation. And that has been mainly driven by the commitments from international, multinational power generation companies such as ENGIE or Enel, who have are more aware and conscious about the requirements set by their shareholders in relation to managing climate-related risks.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo, for bringing in the market aspects, and of course also the important role that governments play in creating these market spaces within which industry can then operate. I think Priya wanted to come in, and then you, Rana.
Sure, I was actually going to echo and sort of build on some of Chuck's comments, but I like the direction that Rodrigo has taken the conversation to. So I'll try to do both. I guess one of the I guess thoughts that I have in terms of the building sector and electrifying the building sector is, you know, one of the earlier projects that I worked on when I was working for a company that works in the sustainable building field was a project in the East Coast where they had heat pump based heating. And, you know, that was my first sort of introduction to that technology. I was surprised that it was there. And that was, you know, back in the early 2000s. And I guess when you think about something like, electric-based cooking, this is not something that is new. Perhaps induction-based, cooking is slightly newer technology. But we have experience, using these different systems. The key question around adopting and transitioning for consumers, customers, people is going to be the economics, right? The economics and also the practical challenges and barriers of electrifying. It's not so much about this technology being so new, because we know these aren't new technologies. It's based on a refrigeration cycle that was discovered, a long time ago. But how do you sort of convince customers who are paying, a third of what they might pay for gas-based heating than they might for electric-based heating, even when you use heat pump technology? And that comes down to these questions of your electricity rates, your gas rates, and what sort of rate structure are you on? Does it make economic sense for your particular rate class, et cetera? And that really gets into some of these details and these questions of the holding company structure of the utility. Is it a gas and electric utility, both, which means that there are some ways where they can sort of make up for the losses in one sector from transitioning, or are they separate companies? And that's where, the point that Rodrigo brought up, I think, is really important, because ultimately, if we don't have corporations and the big energy companies backing up some of this transition effort, it's not going to happen. I recently found out that a gas company in the US, in fact, has developed materials, education materials, and has distributed these to public schools in a particular city, which I won't name, which is trying to talk about how gas is really good and gas is your friend. And so, as we're transitioning, there are a lot of vested interests to not transition. There are vested interests to transition as well. But unless we really sort of have ways to tackle those vested interests that are trying to stop change, I don't think we're going to get there. And that sort of, to me, comes back to questions of, shareholders and owners of companies really, either pushing the leadership towards change, or the leadership themselves really embracing change.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with you. Here in my home country, in Austria, I often hear stories when people want to change their heating system to a sustainable one, to a pellet heating system or a solar system, that the installer is the one who is asking all kinds of questions, because often they're not as familiar with these technologies as they are with just installing a gas fired system, and so this is terribly unsettling the consumers, because of course they are not the experts in that domain, and they rely on the opinion of their installer, and so we have to really work on many fronts to get this energy transition going. I fully agree. Rana, and then over to you, Chuck.
Yeah, so many touching points also to bring as well. But in principle, I think I also agree on the fact that, in the electricity sector, things are moving and it has moved quite well. I think we just don't have the speed and scale that we need actually to achieve the 2030 goals. And for that to actually happen, what we need is more actually policies that could help in de-risking some of these investments, but also political will to phase out energy subsidies and give a good level playing field for all technologies to show which one actually performs better. But if I move to the discussion also around heating and looking again at industry, yes, there are some sectors that don't have the technologies or would take longer, but there's also processes within technology. So I think what we advocate for as an organization is the low and medium heat temperatures in industries. There's quite a lot of good technologies, heat pumps and others that are available. I think the key thing there is, as also Rodrigo said, we need, you know, the utilities, we need new business models to help deliver that to industry, but also we need the skills that you mentioned, Christine, because at the end of the day, you know, the installers, the designers of those systems that are going to industries, and particularly in developing countries, where I thought that's where but you're telling me even in Austria it's the same, you know, we really need to work on skilling this labor force and making sure that they do have the skills that gives the consumers also the confidence in this technology, rather than turning them away from the technologies that we are trying to promote. So yeah, I think it's also in the skilling that we could look at a more equitable transition and make sure that we are obviously also leaving no one behind. It's in the jobs that we are creating in the sector as well. And then I guess the very last point that I would like to bring here is more related to like the government's role in really paving the way for all that and making sure that we have innovations in policies, innovations in social justice that also bring some of these benefits along.
Thank you, Rana. Of course, I can't now pass on to Chuck without saying that this just transition also means, of course, the need to empower women in this space. If we look at ARENA's forecasts, ARENA estimates that there are today about 11.5 million people employed in the renewables industry globally, and this number is supposed to increase to 42 million by 2050. And if we know that currently we have about 32% of women in the renewable energy workforce, which is higher than the 22% in oil and gas, we still see that we lose a big part of talent, and it will be crucial, I think, for this industry to really get the best talents of both men and women, and so that is what GWNET, my organization, is really working for, because we believe that the energy transition would advance more quickly if there would be more gender balance in this field. So that little insert, and now I pass over to Chuck.
Well, let me say that all these issues that have been brought up about electrifying the building sector are real issues that we have been struggling with. There's no question this isn't easy. Let me say one thing though before I address some of those, and that is that it's important to remember that natural gas, when it's burned, produces carbon dioxide. So it produces a strong greenhouse gas, and there are leaks all through the natural gas system. And methane, of course, is a much more powerful greenhouse gas than CO2 is. And also recent studies have shown that indoor air pollution from natural gas stoves is a serious problem that particularly affects young children. So there's plenty of reasons to get off unsustainable natural gas, which is also subject to price hikes. But in terms of electrifying, one thing we can do is it's easier to electrify new buildings. If you electrify a new building, okay, you're not investing in the gas infrastructure, not investing in the gas piping, you have those savings. When you try to electrify an existing home, particularly a home that's heated by natural gas, it's difficult. Ideally, you would do it at a time when a natural gas furnace reaches its end of life. But that doesn't happen in the summertime. It happens in the coldest weather in the wintertime. So people need a rapid turnover. As was pointed out, the heating, ventilating, and air conditioning industry is not very experienced with heat pumps. So they need that experience. If we electrify new buildings, they can gain that experience in the new buildings. As far as bringing down the cost of switching from cheap natural gas heating to electricity, and it's still more expensive with electricity, even with heat pumps, there are things that we can do. For example, put a premium on efficiency, really make sure the building is well insulated. Another thing we can do is rooftop photovoltaics, finance a rooftop PV system that provides that electricity. Again, PV electricity is getting cheaper and cheaper. And then finally, you can go with time of use rates. That's one thing you can't do with natural gas, but with electricity, if you have a home energy management system that times when you use the electricity, you can minimize your costs. Even with all that, we're probably going to need some government incentives to basically convert existing buildings to electricity.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm very pleased the way this debate is leading us, because I was initially, when preparing for this panel, I thought this is going to be a very, very technical discussion. And of course, technology is important, but I think what it nicely brings out here is that the people are also important, and this transition will not only happen on a technological basis, but we also need to get the people and the consumers and the corporations, etc., on board to really make it happen. But still, I would like to come to the aspect of how much R&D you think is still needed to get us to this full available solutions in all the different sectors, be it electricity, buildings, transportation. Do we have commercially viable solutions that are cost effective? And is there a need for policy, especially when we look at the research and development aspects? What's your views on this? Maybe I'll start with you, Priya, and then who else would like to come in, please go ahead.
Sure. I'll try to be brief as well, given our time restrictions. I think we've touched on this question already to some degree, and I think all of the speakers have really noted that, you know, there are technologies that are available in every sector already today. If we take the electricity sector, for example, I'm not really worried about the lack of technological solutions to get to, let's say, 80% or 90% clean or decarbonized. I'm more concerned for reaching that pathway about some of the other barriers, like land use challenges, financing, better planning at the utility level, market design, et cetera. However, where I do think R&D can play a role is in that last 10%, perhaps 20%. And we're starting to now talk a lot about and explore, what does long duration energy storage really look like? There are different forms. How do you sort of bring that need into a planning construct, you know, getting the software tools, the predictive, the analytical tools and capabilities to be, you know, robust enough to help us to plan for that kind of future. Because, you know, as one of my atmospheric science colleagues says, you know, in the future, weather is the fuel. It's not fossil fuel is not the fuel, weather is the fuel. Right. So if we have sort of this, you know, period where you have cloudy days, you know, that persists over 3-4 days, and you have low solar generation, well, you need something to get through that. And that's a combination of, you can either oversize some of your other renewable energy systems, or more realistically, you have a more cost optimal combination of storage and other generation. That's where I think the R&D can be really helpful, but not really just R&D, I think is RD&D, right? So really sort of seeing that commercial pathway through, because that's the point at which we really start to see the price declines. And, you know, you have all the other transformation you need. You have the skills, you have the experience amongst the developers and the contractors. Grid operators will get more experience around how they, you know, dispatch these kinds of systems. That's my view, at least in the electricity sector. And I'm happy to stop at this point and allow others to comment.
Thank you, Priya. Anybody else wants to come in on the RD&D aspect?
Sure, I could just maybe add a few points, because so we've been working, so this year there's the high-level dialogue on energy, which is happening at the General Assembly. And so we've been commissioning a report on technology, innovation, and data needs that allow for, you know, achieving the goals for 2030 and 2050. And so one of the recommendations is obviously increasing investments in RD&D. So basically, I think the figures and estimates that are given by agencies like IRENA and the IEA are in the range of 300 billion that is needed to be invested in the technology innovation in these areas. For sure, also improving the investments in some of the technologies that are still sort of in demonstration phase, or moving more towards larger commercial scale the deployment of these, or demonstration integration of these technologies, like CCUS, for example, in industries. So and then I think the third point, in addition to improving the investment in both of these, is actually improving collaboration and collaboration among different countries on this innovation, because some of the countries, so let's look again at the iron and steel and cement, most of these innovations are happening in Europe, in North America, but then there are also in the globe, in the South, lots of countries that do have industries. And so for them to actually adopt these technologies, we really need to facilitate this collaboration on technology development and transfer to actually help also these countries in taking this pathway towards decarbonization. So that's kind of three things that we are also recommending and sort of an estimation of this figure.
Thank you, Rana. I don't see Rodrigo or Chuck wanting to come in. Yeah, Chuck, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so, I think that this idea of that tackling the last 10% of decarbonizing the grid, that is an issue that we have to deal with. We have some time to deal with it. We're not close to that yet, okay? But I think it is going to be some combination of overbuilding renewables, more transmission and more efficient transmission, and long duration storage. And for the long duration storage, there are a lot of different options. There's various gravity devices, including more pumped hydro, but other clever schemes for using gravitational potential energy. There's green hydrogen that could be stored underground and used in combustion turbines. There's liquid air, there's compressed air energy storage. So I think all these different long duration storage concepts will compete against each other. And the other areas that's going to be hard is aviation's going to be tough. Long distance aviation, we're going to have biofuels, which has land use issues and total net carbon impact issues. Biofuels competing against e-fuels, which are expensive and have their own challenges. Same thing with very large cargo shipping. How do we develop these fuels that are the least expensive and the best for the environment? So I think those are the things that are going to require some R&D. Oh, and then finally, in industry, industry furnaces and kilns are designed with certain flux profiles, certain ways they produce heat. It's not necessarily that easy to convert them to electricity, for example. Converting to hydrogen might be easier, but more expensive. So again, some of the industrial processes will present some challenges in how the equipment has to be redesigned.
I just compliment here, and to be very brief because of the timing. I fully agree also with what has been said, especially Rana, and would say that there's an emphasis on the role that R&D has to reduce uncertainties. Uncertainty on the pace of adoption of certain technologies, on the implications and the impacts of the adoption of certain technologies. I think that's a critical role that R&D has to play. For example, the level of blending that green hydrogen can have into natural gas piping and transportation infrastructure. That's a critical role where R&D can help to alleviate the myths and reduce uncertainties. And that's what I would have to say for today. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo. We are nearly at the end of the panel already. Time has flown by. It was clearly a very dynamic discussion among all the panelists. Still, we are a side event of the Clean Energy Ministerial, so I guess the majority of people viewing this side event are policymakers, and I would ask each and every of you to finish with just what you think the most important message to policymakers on how to accelerate the clean energy transition. Of course, there is a multitude of things, and you don't need to be extensive, but what you consider as the most important point, and I guess by compiling all your 4 messages, we'll get quite a comprehensive picture. So whoever would like to start, please go ahead. But be brief, because we only have a couple of more minutes left.
I can start. I think I'd rather sort of, not get into the technical details. I think we've had a lot of excellent technical discussion. My advice to policymakers is really to think about the institutional aspect, think about how different kinds of institutions can work together, can collaborate. When we think about planning, let's think about planning in a construct that goes beyond the sort of standard, whether if you're in the electricity sector, not really just about the, utility regulatory commission, but what about urban planning and other levels of planning and transportation planning? I think sort of thinking about policies that are addressing these cross-cutting issues and cross-sectoral issues, and sort of not leaving the people dimension behind, and not just, assuming that the transitions will happen, that people will change their behavior. I don't think we can make those kinds of assumptions. We really have to factor in the behavioral element, whether it's institutional culture and behavior or other forms of behavior. We don't often, think about that in a very thoughtful way and integrate that into the implementation of our policies.
Thank you, Priya. Who wants to go next?
Yeah, also on my end, I think one key thing is to focus on the market pull policies more than just technology push. I think if there are market opportunities, market niches that can really represent the value and this low carbon transition that is ongoing, then let's make sure that local domestic policies can open that path and be consistent with the expectations of opening those market niches. There is capital that is gaining attraction and interest to flow into low carbon investments, and so let's make sure to create those market niches as soon as possible, transparenting the real price of carbon emissions into the economic activity. That's it.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Chuck?
So, I think that an important thing that's needed is that policymakers need to think in terms of sustainability. We have to do things that can be sustained. We have to make that transition. And also, when we look at economics, we have to look at the big picture. A recent study showed that air pollution from burning fossil fuels costs $8 billion per day around the world due to healthcare costs. We know there are huge damages from climate change. In terms of this extreme weather, we've reached this new abnormal where weather events keep getting worse. We haven't even reached a new normal stage. And so I think you have to look at the actual social cost of carbon, and that needs to be incorporated into these economic decisions. And when you do that, then you'll have a basis for doing things like a clean electricity standard that requires electricity to be carbon-free by a certain date. You'll be able to make an argument for why a price needs to be put on carbon. But I think that big picture is the way we need to look at things.
Thank you. Last word for you, Rana.
I totally second Rodrigo's point on the market creation, and I would say, just to be brief, for sure, take bold actions and lead the way in terms of setting policies that are really leading for the market creation, and then invest in innovation and people.
Great, thank you. Thank you to all the panelists for your excellent contributions, to Chuck for his presentation, and to all of you for engaging in such an interesting discussion.